Welcome to Question Mark, the podcast, exploring the greatest story ever told with open minds and open hearts.
We light it up, we won't come down, and the sun can't stop us now. Watching it come true, it's taking over you. This is the greatest show, where it's covered in all the colored lights, and the runaways are on in the night. Impossible comes true, it's taking over you. This is the greatest show.
Hello and welcome again to Question Mark, a fortnightly podcast about Mark's Gospel, surely the greatest story ever told. Thank you for joining us today, and do tell your friends if you like it and tell us what we can do better if you don't. My name's David Payne, and I'll be your host for this, the 59th episode in our journey. There's not much more to go now, this journey through this intriguing Gospel. Today we're delighted to have Professor Helen Bond with us. Helen, I believe you are Professor of Christian Origins, and for a few more days, Head of Divinity at the University of Edinburgh. You also have a great podcast called The Biblical Time Machine. I was drawn to the curious case of Judas Iscariot, in which your guest actually questioned, rather than you questioning, whether he was such a bad guy after all. And also what Jesus looked like, which I thought Steph might be interested. You might like that one, Steph. Yeah. So I wonder what you're setting out to do in the podcast, and also what a typical day is like for a professor of Christian Origins. Welcome to the show. Lovely to have you.
Thank you. Well, the podcast first, I do it with the wonderful Dave Roos, who's a journalist from the United States, and it was his idea really. But the podcast, it's called Biblical Time Machine, and the idea is we get back in our time machine and we go back to the biblical period. And it's really historical. So it's aimed at people who want to know more about the history of the Bible. So the history of the books, the history of the times, what people were up to. Why does Genesis describe creation like it does? Were there really 12 tribes? What's going on in the book of Esther? What were the Persians all about? And plenty of New Testament topics too. So we're coming to the end of season 1, and that's got 30 episodes in it. So starting in season 2 after summer, I think. So yeah, it's got busy, and we've got a good following so far. But as for a day in the life of a professor of Christian Origins, well, it's really just a fancy way of saying New Testament. I used to be a lecturer in New Testament, but it's quite common nowadays for people to want to broaden that out a bit. So rather than just confining myself to the New Testament, I also like to look at the sort of the world of the New Testament, Josephus and the historical Jesus, and really going right through to the 2nd century. So this is just a way of sort of looking at the earliest century or so of Christianity.
Brilliant. Great way to find out some background for this podcast. I think they go very well together. Thank you so much for coming. And do you know, Steph, did he just send you a letter and say, please be on our show?
Yeah, just out of the blue.
It's great to have you. Steph, most of our listeners, I think, know who you are. You present Mark's Gospel, and we'll be doing so at the Edinburgh Fringe, in fact, in a few weeks' time, in August this year. The passage we're going to read, Jesus' arrest, is a very familiar one, and yet incredibly shocking. I wonder how you present it in a way that's fresh to those of us who've heard it many times, or do you just let the words speak for themselves?
That's a really interesting question. I think it is a fantastically dramatic episode, isn't it? And there's so many things happening all at once. And I think the answer to your question is yes, I do try and make it fresh. And again, my director, Lisa Gilmore, is the one to blame for this, or to congratulate, because I think she's added some dimensions to this. So you get to see the servant of the high priest's ear being cut off. I actually add Jesus healing the ear in mime. I know it's not even in Mark's Gospel, Helen, and I have very ambiguous thoughts about this, but my director insisted, and we'll see how it goes. But in general terms, it's a fascinating piece. To make it as fast and as furious as possible is the answer, I think, on stage.
Great. For those not watching on YouTube, Helen was shaking her head quite wildly
But smiling a lot at Fast and Furious, all those
and smiling and
immediate-
then nodding. I won't keep doing the I won't keep going with that. Okay, brilliant. Well, that's the introductions over. It's lovely to have you both with us. Today's passage is entitled Jesus Arrested. As usual, Lucy Warner is going to read the passage for us. Do listen to her episode from a couple of episodes ago, which was very good. So she's going to read the passage for us before we start the discussion. Over to you, Lucy.
Mark chapter 14, verses 43 to 50, New International Version. Jesus arrested. Just as he was speaking, Judas, one of the 12, appeared. With him was a crowd armed with swords and clubs, sent from the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders. Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. "The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away under guard." Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, "Rabbi," and kissed him. The men seized Jesus and arrested him. Then one of those standing near drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. "Am I leading a rebellion," said Jesus, "that you have come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I was with you, teaching in the temple courts, and you did not arrest me. But the scriptures must be fulfilled." Then everyone deserted him and fled. A young man, wearing nothing but a linen garment, was following Jesus. When they seized him, he fled naked, leaving his garment behind.
Great, thank you very much, Lucy. So we're going to try and look at the passage in 4 sections, I think, and for those following the Bible, maybe, and see what you both want to say about this. And I will aim to skillfully interweave some questions from our listeners if I can, of which we had a lot this time, so I'm very pleased. Helen, we'll let the guest go first. So perhaps we could look at the crowd and Judas in the first little section. What would you like to say about that first section then? And then give Steph a go after that, I think.
Okay. Yeah, so I suppose Judas turns up with this crowd, and they're armed. They've got swords and clubs, and I mean, clearly they're coming out at night to arrest Jesus, and I suppose they don't know what they're going to find. I mean, one of the strange things about Judas is, what is it that he's betraying? Because he's there at the arrest, and then he just disappears. He's not there again in Mark's gospel. And it seems to be that he's betraying where they can find him, where the chief priests can find Jesus, where he's going to be alone, and where it's quiet for an arrest at night. So he comes along with all these people who've been given to him by the chief priests. And of course, I mean, the reader already knows that this is pointless. Jesus doesn't need swords and clubs to pick him up, but and something that's reinforced by Jesus himself, I suppose, by his own dialogue later.
So why do you think they needed swords and clubs to arrest Jesus? It just to us it seems a bit crazy, doesn't it? After all these years.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think however quiet somebody seems to be, it's one thing to be quiet and teaching people in the temple by day, but Jesus has already done something in the temple. There's that outburst in chapter 11. He's turned over the tables of the money changers and all of that. So that's quite violent in some ways, even if it was only a fairly small scale event. So I suppose the thing is they don't know what to expect. I mean, they'd be pretty stupid to turn up with nothing. And most people in the first century would have had a knife or a club or something, because you don't know who's going to jump out at you, or wild animals, or it would be quite normal, I think, to have some kind of a weapon on you.
Yeah, I mean,
what's your first?
Well, I'm just thinking about this. Sorry, David. I was just thinking about the sword and the club. I think that's right, Helen. I think you never know what's going to happen. And also, I suspect Jesus has got a kind of reputation, not for which he's kind of promoted, but maybe among some people, certainly the people who invited him, who welcomed him into Jerusalem in the first place, he might be someone who to them is some kind of nationalistic hero. He's not necessarily the Messiah Jesus wants them to believe he is. So maybe there's that behind the violence potential here.
He's got these blokes, he's got at least 12 hefty blokes, well, 11 apart from Judas, and all these other women and various other people. So it's quite a, there. Yeah, I think you would be silly to leave your sword and your club at home if you're out to arrest Jesus.
I like it that you're right that Jesus kind of mentions this himself, and I think for me that's the big contrast, that these guys come out with their swords and clubs, and Jesus saying, well, actually, I'm nothing to do with that sort of thing, actually. I love this passage. I thought when I first read it, gosh, there isn't that much to say, but the more I look at it, the more I feel there's brilliant amount of things to say. For me, one of the striking bits when I performed this is when Mark says of Judas, he's one of the 12. And this isn't the first time Mark says that. And I have to ask myself, why is it that Mark keeps reiterating that point? We know already. Why say it again? And it could be because he wants us to get how horrifying this is, and to feel a sense of offense at what Judas is doing. Maybe that's it. And the fact is that one of Jesus's closest friends is doing this, someone who's an insider, not even someone who's been on the outside carping. But I also think maybe it's a reference back to a previous bit in the story where Jesus actually uses those very words. He says, one of you will betray me, one of the people who are dipping their bread into the bowl with me now. So it's like saying that Jesus was spot on. He predicted absolutely right. And that's not just because Jesus is a brilliant fortune teller. I think it's meant to convey the impression that Jesus knows exactly what's going on. These events are exactly what God has planned. And even though it feels like it's chaotic and Jesus is about to be arrested and his enemies are going to be triumphing, that doesn't actually disturb God that much. This is actually what he had planned all along.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus isn't this incredible nationalistic hero who maybe some Jews were expecting. He's a Messiah of peace. And for him to have Jesus crucified would have been, for some people, how can that person be the Messiah? But I think Mark is trying to make it clear to us, Jesus is a prophet who knows exactly what's going to happen. He hears from God. God's in control. So even that little bit is a brilliant bit, I think.
And he still goes ahead with it. I mean, I think that's one of the amazing things too, that it's all of this has been laid down and Jesus knows exactly what's going to happen. He foretells every step of the way, and yet, he still goes ahead with this sort of quiet determination. But one of the things that opponents of Christianity charged against Christianity in the 2nd century was that they said, how can Jesus possibly be the Son of God? Because he made such bad choices in terms of his disciples. He got these 12 guys. One of them is a betrayer. One of them denies him. That's completely ridiculous. If he was the Son of God, he should have known what these people were like. And that was a pagan philosopher called Celsus who was saying that. And I think one of the things that I think Mark is already slightly aware of this, that it's not a great thing for a teacher who's got these disciples to have the disciples almost turning in on him. And so he's very clear that Jesus knows this. This is all part of the plan. It's not the plan going wrong.
Yeah.
This is actually all that's supposed to be happening.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant, Helen. And I think the fact that Judas is one of the disciples, in other words, Jesus's worst enemy is one of his best friends.
Yeah,
has an implication for the guys who are listening to this story and us ourselves. If we happen to be followers of Jesus, what is our real attitude to him? These guys here in this story, apparently, they swear this undying allegiance. They will go through hell and high water for him. But when it comes to the crunch, they're not able to. So maybe, Mark's got in mind the reader, the listener, to get us to think about these all too human characters and wonder what would we be like in their place.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Because, one of the things that scholars think is that there might be some kind of background of persecution in Mark's gospel, and I'm sure you've come across that before in terms of there's a lot of references to persecution. There's talk in chapter 13 to when you're hauled in front of councils, and whether the people have actually experienced persecution or whether it's just something that they're fearful of. People don't really know, but it does feel as though the first hearers of this were sort of very much aware that they could be in this situation. They could be in the situation of having good friends betray them. And later on, of course, the picture of Peter is that big question: what would you do? Would you betray him? And certainly in this passage, you get all the disciples running away at the end, so they don't stand firm.
No.
Helen, I've got to ask, having listened to your podcast about maybe Judas wasn't such a bad guy, is there anything in that, do you think? Or I didn't hear your opinion on that, but I just wondered.
I do think Judas is one of the most fascinating people in the whole tradition, and the gospel authors just don't really know what to do with him. And the brilliance of Mark, I think, is that he says so little. Judas betrays. That's all he does. He's the betrayer, and he betrays, and we're not told at all why he did that. So Matthew sort of suggests that it's for the money, and Luke and John say, well, Satan entered into him. And then for 2,000 years, ever since, we've been spending our time trying to work out, did he want Jesus to be more nationalistic? Was he sort of trying to get Jesus to somehow sort of show his true colors? Was he very much on Jesus's side and trying to, to sort of spark some kind of a showdown between Jesus and the chief priests? And I suppose that's where the sort of more positive picture of Judas comes in, that some people think that he was working with Jesus. Either Jesus sort of was in on it with him, or on his own bat, he's trying to kind of to get that showdown, and he's so sort of sure that when Jesus meets the chief priest, something is bound to happen. But yeah, all kinds of explanations for what Judas might have done here, and the fact is we just do not know. I mean, we have no information. It's possible that Jesus, that the two of them work together, but the way that the story is told, that doesn't seem to be the most likely thing. The way that the story is told is that he, for whatever reason, becomes disillusioned, or maybe somehow the chief priests get to him. They perhaps can sort of influence him. Maybe they threaten his family, or we just don't know what's going on behind the scenes here.
Brilliant, thank you very much. There are lots of questions about Judas. One of them was about his kiss. Gareth wonders why Mark records it. Details are often important in Mark's gospel, and Gareth said, we make a lot of being betrayed by a kiss these days, I think, but was it as significant at this time? Do you think there was anything in that, Steph?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I think Gareth was part of that question is, why would Judas need to indicate who Jesus was? Because surely Jesus was well known what he looked like. And the thing I hadn't noticed until my friend John Burnett mentioned this to me the other day, this particular story, there's no mention of torches. In other words, they're going to the Garden of Gethsemane in pitch blackness. So one explanation for the kiss might be Judas had to indicate who the man was because you can't really see that well.
You had to find him.
Exactly.
Identify him himself.
Yeah. But that's too why the kiss is important. I think the kiss is brilliant. I mean, some people might disagree with this, but as far as I understand, that word kiss in the original Greek doesn't necessarily mean literally kiss. It means love or like. It's just interpreted generally as meaning to kiss. So you could translate this, the one I love or like is the man, and the one I'm going to betray, and the one I want you to arrest. And I think that points up that point I made earlier on about how the one who is closest, who kisses him, who showers him with respect and affection, actually deep down is the one who's his worst enemy. And I think it's asking us the question, who are we deep down in our attitude to Jesus? Do we profess love, profess to kiss, as it were? But actually there are layers within us which are resistant, not in it for Jesus or for God, but maybe for ourselves.
Yeah, I agree. It's all of a part with that one of the 12 thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's that intimate follower, the closeness, and he kisses him because that's what they normally do. You know, that's a normal greeting in the world of the time. And but you know, we the audience know that there's more to this kiss, and this is a treacherous kiss.
Our other faithful questioner, who brings in questions every week and comments, and we love it. Why did they need Judas at all? Couldn't they just have had Jesus followed to know where he was? And was he really that hard to find without a disciple to lead them to him?
Yeah, I think that goes back to the question of what it was that he betrayed. And I do think I suppose they could have had him followed, but, you know, since the Gospels suggest that sort of Judas went and offered his services, I suppose they thought, well, yeah, this is the easiest thing. Just tell us when he's alone, when he's in a quiet place, when we can come and get him. That seems to be what he betrays, rather than specifically anything about Jesus, because they have all been listening to Jesus themselves anyway, so they have enough ammunition as they see it.
Yeah, absolutely, Helen. I think that's exactly right. They want to find Jesus when he's completely vulnerable, and there are not then many people around him, because the previous episodes suggest a crowd are really very much on Jesus's side, and the chief priests don't want to arrest him in the open because they fear there's going to be a riot. So here, in secret, if they found an ideal location.
Has anyone mentioned the fact that it's a crowd rather than chief priests, and it wasn't actually them themselves that came and? Yeah,
that's fascinating.
I just find that very interesting. And I can't remember who it was, but one of our guests mentioned the crowd is mentioned as a character within lots of the stories in Mark, and this is where the crowd was. The crowd welcomed him into Jerusalem. The crowd said, "Crucify him," and the crowd are now arresting him.
Yeah,
but it's a crowd from the chief priests, though. So it's not your normal crowd. I mean, you're right, the crowd is normally on his side, and until, strangely enough, you get to Pilate's tribunal, and suddenly when the chief priests are, you know, working on them, they abandon Jesus. But this is very a specific crowd. It's a crowd from the chief priests. But again, I think that sense of, you know, a crowd, I mean, who knows how many people are meant by a crowd, but it suggests, you know, it's an over-the-top thing, you know, loads of people, and they've got swords and they've got clubs, and, you know, all these people just to arrest one man who just stands there, openly says, yeah, you know, why all the fuss? Here I am. And just big contrast there, I think.
Yeah,
all very dramatic. I mean, it's not surprisingly that John makes this even more dramatic, and has, you know, Roman soldiers and everybody falls down when Jesus says who he is.
Yes, some of the others have the high priest's ear being the servant's ear being healed. Mark doesn't, and Gareth wondered again: is there any reason for this? Is he just stating the facts and moving on, or any thoughts on that?
Just being Mark, I think. I mean, Mark always does that. He just tells you the minimum, and then he's off, you know, and leaving you saying, "Well, I've got a whole list of questions here." But I think it's more that. You know, healing is far more of a Lucan theme. Luke, you know, I think obviously Luke felt a bit sorry for this poor guy who's just lying there, or whatever he's doing with his ear chopped off. So, and can't really imagine that Jesus allows that to happen in his name and does nothing about it. And so it's Luke. It's only Luke actually who has the chief priest's servant the ear put back.
Yeah, absolutely. And I, you know, I feel, as I said earlier, a little bit uncertain about why I do the mime in that performance, which Lisa, my director, insists on producing for me. But I think the interesting thing here is that it's the bystander, actually, because I think, am I right in thinking, Helen, in the other gospel accounts, that person, the person who draws the sword, is identified as a disciple, but in this case it's not identified at all. And I was reading an article about this which suggested it could have been one of the crowd. Just in the melee, in the confusion and the chaos, he draws a sword and whoops, oh yeah, the right ear of the servant of the high priest has suddenly been lopped off. So it's not about someone, standing up for Jesus with a sword, which is what is true of the other gospel accounts, it seems, but just something that happens in the chaos of the moment. I don't know what you thought about that, Helen. Is that...
Yeah, I've seen that interpretation. I mean, it could be. It certainly is a bystander. But again, it's interesting as the tradition moves through the various gospel accounts. By the time we get to John's account, it's Peter who's chopping, and he gets a name as well. He's called Malchus, and it's the right ear as well. I don't think Mark says which ear. Does he?
No, he doesn't. That's very true. He doesn't say it.
But yeah, so you get all these details sort of added to it. But yeah, I think that's right. You get this sense of a kind of a sort of slightly chaotic sort of scene, apart from Jesus, who is this calm, sort of tranquil character in the middle, and around him is all this sort of mayhem.
Yeah.
This is we've actually had quite a lot of questions this time, and we're having an opportunity to get them in, so I'll make the most of it. Anne asks, was it actually their intention to arrest Jesus' disciples as well? And this is jumping ahead a bit, but if one disciple was seized and only managed to escape by removing his clothing, it suggests they were about to be arrested and only just managed to flee in time to save their lives. Was this incident included to show the imminent danger and great fear they all experienced at that moment? And you mentioned persecution just now, Helen, didn't you?
Yeah, you mean the naked guy?
Yes.
Yeah, that's such an interesting passage. I mean, there's a whole industry of people trying to work out, who is the naked guy? What's he doing there? And when Matthew and Luke and John retell their story, they just miss him out. They think we're not having the naked guy in here. And there's some tantalizing verbal links between the naked guy here and the young man at the tomb, and the cloth, the shroud is the same word that's used here for linen cloth. So you can read all sorts of symbolism into this. On one level, I think it's just yet another character who runs away rather than stand up for Jesus. And I think that's a theme throughout Mark's passion narrative. So you have the disciples running away here. You have Peter running away later on. You have the crowd leaving him to one side in front of Pilate. And I think this is just one more character who would rather run through the streets naked. I mean, that was hugely shameful. He'd rather do that than stand up for Jesus. At a more subtle level, you could say that this guy has turned up in a shroud. He's ready for death. He's ready for, whatever following Jesus brings. But in the end, he's not quite ready for it yet. And, at a very deep level, you could say nobody is ready for it until Jesus himself has gone before and suffered death. And then, people can follow. That's perhaps too deep and subtle, but I think you can get all sorts of different layers from this really interesting story.
Yeah, I mean that's the first time I've heard a couple of those interpretations, and that's absolutely brilliant. You're right, there is an industry, isn't there? I've only read about 6 or 7 articles on it, but it definitely there are loads of things that people say. What some people say, this happened at a performance just the other day, actually, in Lichfield Cathedral. A man came up to me and said, this guy at the end, a naked chap, I think that was Mark himself. And that's kind of a popular theory. But for me, you're right. I think the verbal links with other passages in Mark's Gospel, particularly the ending, because that's the word sidron, is that right? Sidron,
yeah.
Sidron, for the cloth that's only mentioned one more time, and that's it's the burial sheet that Jesus is wrapped in by Joseph of Arimathea, and the young man. That word there is only mentioned one more time at the end in chapter 16, and at the end of chapter 16, verse 8 anyway, the women flee rather than tell anyone the story.
Yeah.
So all sorts of connections. And so it's very suggestive, isn't it, of something deeper and wider. But I agree with you. In the end, for me, the most interesting feature is here's another person who seems like he's a devoted follower, but at the last minute, he doesn't pull it off. He doesn't follow through. It's underlining something that Mark's been mentioning all along. I read an article the other day that suggested that Jesus had clothes. Of course he did. But when we see Jesus next, in the next chapter, I should say, in the crucifixion, those clothes are ripped from him. He gets robed with a purple robe, and the soldiers make fun of him. Then they put his own clothes back on him, and then they crucify him. And the next bit says they divided up his clothes, seeing which one, they were casting lots for who would get which. In other words, Jesus is left naked, potentially. That's the assumption we're left with. So I'm just wondering whether there's a comparison being drawn in a listener's mind between this young man who's left naked but runs away, and Jesus who's left naked and dies, goes through with what God wants.
That's a really interesting, that's a really interesting suggestion, because I mean, there's no doubt that Jesus would have been naked when he was crucified. I mean, there's no way that Romans left you any kind of dignity. The whole point of crucifixion is to be as shameful as possible. And those crucifixes we see in churches and things where Jesus has the little loincloth. I mean, that's for us. It's not a historical representation of what it would have been like. I mean, he certainly would have been naked. But you're right. I mean, that's a really interesting, and I think it does kind of support that idea that there is something there about the young man presenting himself sort of ready for death, and naked and sort of almost there, but he's just not quite there, and he runs away and he's not there. So there's just something very fascinating about him, I think.
I think, at the risk of making this sound really banal, I think nevertheless I will mention this, a kind of personal story, because some of our listeners might be thinking, oh, what's this to do with me? This is all very interesting. Even if the disciples were like this young man, ready to go through with it until the final call, and they run away. What's that got to do with me? We don't live in the first century. Most of us aren't suffering persecution. But I think in Mark's gospel, I don't know if you agree with this, the implication is that going to your crucifixion, following Jesus and being crucified, isn't just necessarily a matter of physical death. It's also putting to death your own ego wishes. You're putting those things aside, and you're dying to those. You're denying yourself, as Jesus says in chapter 8. And this story is meant to stimulate, that question, I think, even for us modern Christians. Most of us in the West certainly aren't being persecuted. But nevertheless, are we dying to ourselves in the way that the gospel emphasizes? And the other day, I had a brilliant morning where I spent the whole day giving to others. My wife was happy, my grandchildren were happy, everyone was happy. And at the last minute, I decided to do something really selfish and lock myself away and forgot about them all. So at the last minute, I ruined everything. And I know it's just a trivial example, but I put myself first at that point. I wasn't really interested in making others feel happy, to sacrifice for them, to serve them as Jesus would want me to. So it is interesting about how we want to preserve our autonomy, our independence, our selfishness sometimes, maybe.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And that's that thing about, you have to be servant of all, a slave, deny yourself, take up your cross. That's really strong in Mark. And it's an incredibly hard message. It's all or nothing, and nobody really in the story, I think, is able to follow Jesus, and that's really quite scary. Nobody gets away with it until and it's up to hearers of the message to think about can I possibly be a follower? And you've got plenty of examples of people who don't manage it.
Yeah, absolutely.
We jumped ahead a minute ago to the young man wearing nothing, missed out Jesus's words, which probably isn't a great idea. So going back to, am I leading a rebellion, said Jesus, that you've come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I was with you, teaching in the temple courts, and you did not arrest me, but the scriptures must be fulfilled. And then everyone deserted him and fled. We haven't got any questions about this as such, but why did Jesus mention the scripture, and are there any scriptures?
It's weird, isn't it? Because sometimes you get quotations of specific scriptures, but quite often in Mark you just get sort of, oh, you know, this was done to fulfill the scriptures. And I don't know whether it's just that Mark doesn't have a handy scripture by his side, or I think more likely he just imagines that this is a fulfillment of all the scriptures. You know, it's not just a bit of Psalms or Isaiah or whatever, but he thinks all of the scriptures are pointing to Jesus, and all of the scriptures are pointing to Jesus's death and vindication by God. So I think he's got such a strong sense that that Jesus's life and death and resurrection is in accordance with the scriptures, that he doesn't really feel he needs to kind of quote passages most of the time.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. But interestingly, when he does quotes, there are specific passages he quotes from, but not here, as you say. And I couldn't agree with you more. I think what Mark's trying to convey is this is something God has planned from the beginning of the story of Israel. This is Israel's story coming to its culmination, and it's a new day, it's a new age that Jesus is inaugurating, where God's love and blessing is going with the children of Israel, but also out to the world. Everything has been planned in advance for this moment. And so to call it the scriptures must be fulfilled is to, get us to understand this universal theme. I have to say about Jesus's reaction, is it true, Helen, that in the other gospels a point is made about violence, that Jesus is a peacemaker, and this is what he's trying to suggest, that I'm not one for swords and clubs. Why are you coming out to arrest me with swords and clubs? I think it might be going on here, but I'm just wondering whether Jesus is more intent on maybe convincing his hearers here, that he's completely innocent. He was teaching in the temple courts, but you did nothing to stop me then. In other words, you couldn't find anything against me. In fact, I was teaching in the temple courts with authority. I'm underlining the fact I have authority here. You did nothing against me. So you've had to come out in secret with violence to bring me in. But I'm making it clear that actually I am completely innocent. I don't know if that's true. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I'm sort of underlining too the the underhandedness of it all as well, because I mean that's going to come out really clearly in the Jewish trial of Jesus. I mean, that's a hideous passage. It's one of the worst passages in Mark. I think it's so opposed to the Jewish chief priests, but it's a kangaroo court, and they've got together with the express intention of putting Jesus to death, and they just engineer things so that he dies. I mean, that it's not a fair trial that he's going to have. And I think this is underlining that first bit of that there were all sorts of opportunities. They could have arrested him in the light, but they don't. They wait till darkness, and everything they do is going to be underhand and really illegal. It's those people, the Jewish authorities in Mark's gospel, who are presented as the ones who are underhand and illegal
in that context,
and guilty, really, of engineering.
Sorry to interrupt you. In that context, this idea of darkness is quite interesting, isn't it? I don't know, that you're right, that he was in the light, he was teaching in the temple courts. This is in the dark. The trial that you just mentioned is in the middle of the night. It's all done in this kind of sinister atmosphere, isn't it?
Exactly. If I was putting this on and if I was dramatizing Mark's gospel as opposed to whatever historically happened, but if I was dramatizing Mark's gospel, I would definitely have it dark and gloomy and looks, and the whole thing is presented, like I said, as this kangaroo court, and they have one intention: they just want to put him to death. And it's a pretty horrible picture, and I think a very difficult picture for Christians nowadays to deal with, this anti-Jewishness that you get in the Gospels.
Time is running away with us, I'm afraid. I would really like to know, Helen, from your point of view, broadening out a bit, what it is about Jesus and his message in the New Testament that you find so compelling, and do you relate to him in everyday life? Do you have any tips that our listeners might find helpful?
I don't know. I suppose I'm just fascinated by Jesus. I've written a couple of books on the historical Jesus, and more recently on Mark's Gospel, and I just love kind of reading these texts and trying to understand the person who inspired them, and the person who still inspires people 2,000 years later. I mean, that's pretty amazing. But particularly Mark, because I think, as we've already said, the message in Mark, this self-denial, it's so total, that it's an incredible and an incredibly difficult message.
We've got a minute left. Does either of you want to make one last point, or anything we haven't had a chance to say? Steph's nodding his head, shaking his head.
No.
Oh, good. Well, I'll ask a really tricky question. Well, my question. This is my question. I want to know, why do we have to have these podcasts? Why does it have to be so complicated? Why can't we have, these are the 5 points of Christianity, this is how to do it? Go.
I'll answer first. I mean, not that I don't sympathize with your question, but the more I read this, the more I realize how beautifully crafted and multi-layered and exciting it is to read. And it doesn't mean that we all have to be able to be scholars, and yet at the same time, there's something about this never-ending treasure trove of riches that we can return to again and again and find something else out that we never knew before, something deeper, even more helpful to us in our walk with God.
Good.
Yeah, I think so too. I think it's poetic and imaginative and not complicated. If you think it's complicated, you're looking for one meaning. What is the one meaning that explains this? And you never find it. It's every passage has multiple meanings, and every time you look at them, you'll find different meanings, and depending on what questions you have at the time. So I think it's deeply poetic and deeply meaningful.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Steph and Helen, thank you so much for taking time to share your thoughts with us. It's been a lot of fun, enlightening, and I got to ask my questions, as it always is, sharing our thoughts. We've enjoyed having you with us too, lovely listener, lovely watcher on YouTube, and we hope you check the website iam-mark.com and the Facebook community, as well as Helen's podcast. That is all we have time for today. So it's goodbye from Helen Bond in Edinburgh.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye from Stephen Smart in San Francisco this time.
Goodbye.
And from me in Southampton, goodbye until next time. Goodbye.
If you enjoyed this episode of Question Mark and don't want to miss any future episodes, be sure to click on the subscribe button. This also means other people can find the podcast and join the conversation too. We'd also love if you could leave a review so we know what was good and what we can improve for future episodes. If you want to find out more about I Am Mark, Stephen Smart's solo word-for-word dramatisation of Mark's Gospel, go to www.sleek.bio/IamMark, where you can sign up for free for his newsletter and a whole host of other goodies. Join us and our special guests next time, where we'll continue to explore the greatest story ever told together. If you want to get involved with the podcast or have any questions or comments in the meantime, please do get in touch using the I Am Mark social media channels. We'd love to hear from you.
We light it up, we won't come down, and the sun can't stop us now. Watching it come true, it's taking over you. This is the greatest show, where it's covered in all the colored lights, and the runaways are on in the night. Impossible comes true, it's taking over you. This is the greatest show.